they can still take a look at this. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We appreciate you all being here today. We're just going to start by doing introductions. One of the great things about participating with the chapter and doing this workshop is it's a great opportunity for you to meet other folks that are taking the test. And so in just a second, we'll go around the virtual room and hear from you. And you can see if there's other folks that are taking the test either this spring or in the fall that you want to form a study group. This is a great way to connect with people. And we'll talk obviously at the end about resources and some tips, but we'll give you that tip now that it's a good time to connect. So I'll start. My name's Erin Fosdick, and I'm the Professional Development Officer for APA Colorado. And so one of the things that I do is work with the Professional Development Committee, of which our other two presenters who will introduce themselves in just a second are part of. And we are charged with a number of things, one of which is helping folks prepare to become AICP. And so we do a couple trainings a year. They can vary. Usually it's similar content, but if you're taking the exam in the fall and want to join us again in October, you're welcome to do that. This is the smallest group that we've had in a while. So it'll be a great opportunity for us to just really dive in today. In my professional life, I'm the president and CEO for the Longmont Economic Development Partnership. I spent about 20 years in long range and strategic planning and have just really transitioned over to economic development. There's a lot of crossover between planning and ED. So, I took my AICP in 2007 and did pass my test. So I look forward to helping you all succeed as well. And I'll turn it over to Morgan to introduce herself.
Morning. My name is Morgan Hester, and I serve on the Professional Development Committee with Erin. We have done several of these trainings and are 100% here to help y'all succeed in taking your exam, figuring out the best way to study. At the end of this presentation, we'll have a slide for how you can contact the three of us. Please do not hesitate to shoot an email over if you're kind of stuck on something, or if you have someone else, maybe in your office or a colleague who has questions also. We are open to all of it. But I serve on the National Exam Committee for APA. So that is working with other planners across the nation on best updates for the exam questions. I will say that this training is not giving you what those questions are. What we will be going over are questions that are similar to what you can expect on the actual exam. I'm also the chair of the Youth and Planning Committee for APA Colorado. And professionally, I am the Long Range Planning Division Manager for the City of Colorado Springs. So we focus on policy, neighborhood planning, maintenance of the comp plan, and other things that in our office, we like to say don't fit under a specific category. So we get the fun stuff, which Kate is going to talk about a little more because she and I get to work together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
All right. Morning, everybody. I'm Kate Wentz. I passed my AICP exam in 2017, and I have been helping or participating in a few of these PDO trainings. I am on the Professional Development Committee with Erin and Morgan. I'm also the South Central Area Representative for APA Colorado, so I am the general sort of representative for the 14 counties in the southeastern part of the state. And I am very excited to be here this morning. I passed my exam by 1 point. So there's no margin, like a passing is passing, and I'm excited to help some folks here today learn more about the exam and some strategies for how to take the exam. As Morgan mentioned, professionally, I'm a planning supervisor with the City of Colorado Springs in the Long Range Planning Division, and I get to work under Morgan, and we work on a variety of different topics. And one of the cool things that I am charged with doing this year is working on a demographics program. So that's one of the fun things that doesn't fit into the rest of planning as the department at large, but we're really excited to start focusing on that stuff. So Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And, thanks to Morgan and Kate for taking time on your Saturday to be with me doing this. As Morgan mentioned, we'll share our contact information at the end of this presentation. You can feel free to reach out to any of us. And obviously, we all work sort of in I work in economic development now, but kind of in that longer range strategic special projects realm. But if you have specific questions on something related to transportation, development review, environmental planning, we have access to a lot of folks on our board and in the APA Colorado network that we can hook you up with an expert. So if as you're studying for the test today, and we can talk about this more as we're going through kind of the areas that the test covers, we're happy to put you in contact with other experts in the field and other folks that are on the professional development committee. So we'd like to just take a second and talk about who we have on our call today. If anyone has issues with camera or audio, you can just put your intro in the chat. I'll just go down the list. If you wouldn't mind turning your camera on and introducing yourself, so who you are. If you want to say where you work, that's great. That's not necessarily what defines you, so you can say something else if you want, if you're a student. And then again, when you're planning to take the exam, and maybe if you've started studying, if there's anything that you've found particularly helpful that you want to share with the group, or anything that you are really hoping that we cover today. So let's start with Jeremy.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jeremy Brown. My background's actually in urban design and landscape architecture. I spent about a decade working in the private sector there, and I have transitioned over into planning. I'm the city planner for the city of Steamboat Springs, and undecided if I'll take the test this spring or this fall, but kind of kicking off and getting the ball rolling.
Awesome. Well, welcome to planning, Jeremy. We're glad you've transitioned over. Do you work with Brad?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
Okay, cool.
We have a small department, so I work with him a lot. And that's actually one of the things from my background in urban design, working with him in some of the long range planning stuff, that a lot of it's getting kicked off this year. So
Great. Yeah, you guys are doing some exciting things.
yeah, revising our landscape portion of our code. So I get to help with that.
Will be an asset in that. So great. Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Jeff Barnhill. I do city planning for the city of Aspen, and probably plan on taking the test in the spring, but life's getting pretty hectic, so we'll see.
That is definitely true. Thanks for taking time on Saturday. Garrett.
Hey, good morning, y'all. My name is Garrett Scott. I'm the town planner for the town of Fraser, Colorado. My previous background actually is in civil engineering. That's what I majored in undergrad. I worked as a civil engineer in private consulting for about 5 years before making the switch over to planning. I do have a PE license, so I'm not a stranger to, challenging tests for certifications, but planning is kind of a new area for me, certainly. And I know I have a lot to learn, and I really appreciate you all taking the time on Saturday to do this. So thank you.
Well, I'm sure your prep for the PE will serve you well. I've heard that's a very challenging exam. So,
well, it covers different stuff for sure, but yeah.
Great. Jerome.
My name is Jerome Rouser, and I am a transportation planner at the North Range MPO. And planning is my first career. So my background is in planning. I got my master's degree in planning from KU, and then moved out here for this job. So I jokingly say I'm a Kansas escapee, even though Kansas isn't that bad, but and I plan on taking the test in spring.
Awesome, Jerome. Thank you. Let's see, Heaven. Okay, not sure if we have video or audio. Let's go to Peyton.
Hey everyone, my name is Peyton Heitzman. I'm a planner for the town of Eagle, so on the I-70 corridor. I've been with the town for about 4 years, and this is my first full-time planning position. My master's is in public policy, so I don't have the formal planning training, but I am planning to take the test in the spring. I've been studying quite a bit. It feels like an overwhelming amount of information, just kind of getting into the different topics, but I'm excited for this training and excited to continue my studies.
Great. Thank you, Peyton. We've got a lot of folks in the mountains, so you guys have probably been trapped in your house for a long time, right? Hopefully nothing today. Okay, I know Joanne said can't keep camera on. I don't know if you want to come on audio and introduce yourself, Joanne.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm actually from California. I'm from a region in San Joaquin County. It's called Lodi. It's near Stockton. I've been a planner for 5 years. I have my master's in planning from UC Berkeley. And yeah, I am looking to take the exam this spring.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. We're buried under like 3 feet of snow out here, so we're jealous that you're in California. Okay, Jamie?
Morning, my name is Jamie. I'm a planner 1 with the town of Vail, so also in the Eagle Valley. I used to live in old Colorado City and Colorado Springs, so definitely a fan of that area. Anyway, I got my master's degree in planning from CU Denver a couple years ago, so looking to do the exam. And I guess one question I had, I haven't had a lot of time to devote to it yet this year, so whether that's realistic to shoot for this spring, or if it may be something that needs a little more time. But yeah, thanks for the event.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about tips and resources for studying. I'd say one thing is everyone's different, right? There's definitely some benefits probably to taking it pretty soon after you graduate, because you're in study mode and there's a lot of things that are fresher in your mind than they would be in mine. But we can talk more about that as we go. And then we'll circle back. I think, Kevin, you're the last one on the list that we haven't heard from, but it looks like you're going to type in chat for now. So you've been a planner for over a year, graduated 2 years ago with a bachelor's in urban studies, MS in planning 2 years ago, background in sustainability, but mostly work on fair housing. Plan on taking the test in the fall. Great. So it sounds like we've got some folks that have some expertise in housing, in landscape architecture, transportation. So a good group, a good diverse group. And we'll go from there. If you want, you're welcome to keep your cameras on. You don't have to, but we would love to see your faces. What we're going to do is just kind of do a quick overview. We'll give you some background information. We'll start here with why is AICP. We'll talk a little bit about the exam itself, kind of some of the changes that have happened in the last year or two, what the content is. Then we'll go through some practice questions. Hopefully all of you had a chance to see the practice exam. And as Morgan mentioned, these are not actual questions from the exam. APA is very protective of actual exam questions. So anytime you see practice exams, which are a very kind of comforting and good way to study, those will be different questions than what's actually on the exam, but it gives us an opportunity to kind of talk through some of the topic areas. So why AICP? I think this is something, obviously you're all here, so you've already thought about this, but we do really feel at the chapter, and our board talks about really making sure that people understand what the credential brings, right? You're putting a lot of time and effort into studying and passing for this exam. So it does give you some distinction among other planners. It can help when you're having conversations with the public for them to understand that you've taken the time to earn this credential and that you're continuing your education and staying current with topics. It can definitely enhance opportunities for employment and other programmatic things. So sometimes will require AICP.
No, not at all.
Will prefer.
Not at all.
It helps you stay informed, certainly with the continuing education requirements. You really need to stay relevant, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are. But it's something that, you know, is really good for you as you progress in your career. Oftentimes, the salary surveys show that folks that have their AICP actually earn a higher salary, and so that's obviously something as we're working that we want to see. And then, you know, we all get to put the letters after our name, so that's a fun thing as well. And again, a way to communicate your credential with folks. The APA has really been trying to streamline the process. And so this is particularly relevant for a few of you that may have graduated but not earned all of the professional experience. And so they've really tried to streamline and go to a one-path system. And so many of you probably already know this. They talk about this, I know, in a lot of planning programs, but once you are ready, you can sign up for the exam and take the exam. So register, schedule the exam, take the test. If you don't have the necessary education or professional experience yet, but you're working on that, you'll become an AICP candidate. And then when you meet those experience and education requirements, you will become full AICP. And so it's a way to do things kind of more on your own schedule and not have to wait until you, you know, particularly if you're someone who maybe comes from an allied profession and you don't have that same education requirements met, or you don't have enough professional experience, it enables you to take the test when you're ready to go. Also been some changes to fair exam goals. APA is really committed to trying to address and increase diversity and inclusion. We want to make sure we're being equitable with our candidates. And so there's been some changes to how that works with the exam, and really a focus on trying to be more fair. And then the last change I'll mention is we have continually added some mandatory credits. So once you pass and you're meeting your required continuing education, you'll need to make sure that every 2 years you're getting credits in the areas of law, ethics, and equity. And then there's a targeted topic, which currently is sustainability and resilience, and that'll change every few years. And so you'll be able to earn credits in lots of other areas, but these are the ones that you need to have some specific training and content on. And those are really the things that the profession has said are of utmost importance. And we want to make sure that everyone is staying up to date with these items. So the exam itself has changed, frankly, from when we all took it, and it does continue to evolve. As Morgan mentioned, there is a national exam committee that looks at how do we make the exam better? How do we keep it relevant? How do we add questions from things that are coming up in our profession? How do we continue to improve? I think based on what I've heard, and Morgan can talk more about this when we go through the practice exam, is there's some new structure for the questions, and that's something to consider. I think some of those will be welcome, but obviously there's some new topic areas that are covered. One thing that they do, and this is just something to tuck away, it's not going to change the way you study, but the new questions are considered pre-test. And so when you take the exam, there'll be 20 or so questions that aren't counted toward your final score. And they're really doing that so that they can calibrate these questions, make sure they're good questions, make sure that, you know, 90% of people aren't missing them. That would kind of indicate those maybe aren't the best type of questions, but you won't know what those are. So just study, do your best on all of the questions. We're going to talk in just a second about the exam content. And so they've really rebalanced how we're, what areas that we're covering within the exam, again, to be more relevant. So just FYI, there's new passing scores that are being developed. And so your exam score may not be immediately available. I think this is still true, Morgan. Is that your understanding, or have they? Yes, I'm seeing you nod. Okay. So you'll take the exam, obviously, on a computer, and then they'll mail you your exam results. And that could change by the time, for those of you that are taking it in the fall, but that's our understanding still. So the actual exam is set up. You'll have, 4 hours total scheduled, a half hour for a tutorial, and then 3.5 hours for the 170 total questions. Again, remember, 20 of those that are going to be sprinkled throughout are pre-test questions. You won't know what those are, so just do your best on all of them. And then your results will be mailed to you 6 to 8 weeks after you complete the test. So what does the exam cover? I'm sure if you've done any looking at this, this is familiar to you, but you can see how it's broken up amongst these 9 or so topics. Big areas, and we'll kind of go through these, are fundamental planning knowledge, plan and policy development, plan implementation, communication and interaction, research and assessment, and then there's a number of other topics that have some questions. So this is helpful as you're thinking about where do you really focus your efforts on studying. You might look at these areas to kind of see where you want to put most of your knowledge. The other thing you can look at is if you're particularly strong in one area, maybe you focus your studying in areas that you don't know as much about. So research and assessment is going to be about 11% of the questions. Every exam is going to be slightly different, and so this could fluctuate, but this is kind of the general rule of thumb. And so this is really all about how do you conduct research, how do you gather and interpret data, what types of spatial analysis might we be looking at and using as planners, how do you structure and involve the community in various engagements. You'll see that kind of throughout a number of areas, but this is really about the methods of that. And then, just kind of the general data collection pieces here. Fundamental planning knowledge, this is one of the largest categories, and this is where a lot of the, what I'll call give me questions are, sort of some of the memorizations. So history of planning, planning movements, people that have been influential in planning, legal principles, the statutory basis for planning, patterns of settlements, general terminology, so some of the definitions and principles related to the profession, core values, and then some technology questions. So these are a lot of the kind of memorization and thinking about some of the things that you might have learned in kind of your planning 101 classes. Communication and interaction is another relatively large category. So thinking about how we communicate, how we are inclusive and culturally appropriate, how we're respectful, what are some of the things that we do to practice active listening. You might have some questions here around leadership. There's another category that gets into that too. Social justice and decision making. Again, you see community outreach here. This would really be more about the specific strategies and techniques and how you get feedback from folks. Looking at how you evaluate, maybe you evaluate your engagement strategy, maybe your plan evaluation, and then how you navigate political situations and some of the tools and techniques you'd use there. Another one of the biggest categories related to plan and policy development. So this is where you're going to see some of the nuts and bolts around how do you develop a plan? What are the steps in the planning process? What goes into policy development at the various levels? So you could see questions on state and federal laws here. Some of the equity questions that we'll see, again, when you're thinking about plan and policy development, how do you consider equity within that? How do you include stakeholders? Applying innovation and best practices. So again, thinking about that plan development, what are some of the best practices? Financing, plan implementation. So this is where you could see some things on, capital improvements, programming, things of that nature. And then again, I think you'll see equity and anti-discrimination sort of woven throughout. And so for this category, how would you make sure that you're inclusive and equitable when you're developing plans and policies? They have revised this, and plan implementation, I think recognizing the importance of implementation is now its own category. And so thinking about once we've created the plan, once we've developed the policies, how do we actually implement those? So how do you develop and interpret regulations and policies? This could really have some questions around how do you administer a zoning code? How do you finance things? So if you are calling for things in plans, what are some tools that you might finance with? How do you assess projects? How do you do project management? How do you create partnerships? How do you use partnerships to help with your plan implementation? What are specific actions and assignments, workflows, again, project management, thinking about evaluation, monitoring techniques, timeframes and tools and methods for updating plans and policies. So those are the types of questions that could be covered in this section. Administration and management's a little bit less, so really thinking about the nuts and bolts of project or program management, thinking about some of the internal organizational items that a planner might have to address, managing some of those external relationships. And again, that could be with elected officials, that could be within a department. Some questions specifically on mentoring and what that might look like. And then, results-oriented management and accountability. So thinking about kind of, again, those organizational pieces and how you might put systems into place to ensure accountability within your team. Leadership, again, specifically called out here, a small category, but you'd want to really think about what are the ethical aspects of advocacy? How can a planner work within those systems to balance their duty to the public with advocacy? What are some of the structures that are in place around accountability and transparency, particularly of leaders and decision makers? How do planners contribute to problem solving and the decision-making process? Again, you see equity, diversity, and inclusion here, and thinking about that from a leadership perspective. We see coaching and mentoring. Again, this is sort of from the mentor perspective, whereas maybe we're in the administration and management section also considering what it looks like from a mentee perspective. You could have some questions on professional development and volunteering here. Again, a pretty small overall perspective or percentage of the exam. Areas of practice, this is another pretty big one, and this is kind of a catch-all. So this is like, what are all the topics that we might cover in planning? So you can see a pretty exhaustive list here, everything from long-range and current planning to economic development to food systems and hazard mitigation, public health, housing, historic preservation, infrastructure resources, parks, recreation, and open space, regional planning, small town planning, urban design, sub-area plans, neighborhood plans, transportation and mobility. Again, this is really sort of the topical areas of planning and just thinking about some of the things that you might encounter. For example, if you're a transportation planner, what might you need to know about level of service? If you're working in development review, what might you need to know about FAR or a subdivision process? So thinking about some of those areas of practice. One thing that we'll talk about today, it's probably important to note here, this exam is a national exam. So I know we've got someone here from Colorado or from California joining us. We're in Colorado. There's lots of folks throughout the nation taking this exam. Keep that in mind as you're taking the exam, that the responses to the questions are going to be general, right? So don't, if you're thinking about, you're a development review planner and you have a specific process for creating subdivisions in your jurisdiction, don't get too nuanced, right? This is a national exam, and so it's really a little bit more general. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as you're going through. AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct is another pretty big category. About 10% of the questions could be related to this. This is frankly, a challenging one to study for. There's a good book that right now the name is escaping me. Everyday Ethics for Practicing Planners, I think is the name. Is that right, Morgan? Yeah, you're nodding. Okay.
I'm going to Google it and put the link to it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So questions in this section, obviously we have a code of ethics as AICP. We also have, just as planners, a responsibility to the public, obviously, to our clients and employers, and to the profession overall. So you could have questions sort of about the code itself, and we'll see a couple of those in our practice test. You could have scenarios and sort of what is the ethical way to address something. And then obviously there may be some questions on what happens if there's an ethical complaint, what happens if there's a judgment against a planner. We always like to take this opportunity that, once you earn your AICP and you've studied for countless hours and you've taken and passed the test, do not commit a serious crime because you could have your AICP revoked. We joke that that's probably not the only reason not to commit a felony, but it's a good one just to keep in mind, right? You don't want to have to take the test. You don't want to take the test for nothing. So those are the big areas. And so what you'll see today is the questions we're going to go through. Again, these aren't actual test questions, but they cover some of the same content. And this is really meant to simulate a review. So we did email a practice test to you all. If you didn't have a chance to take it, that's okay. We were trying to do some question updates, and so we got it out a little bit later than we normally do, so I apologize for that. but that's okay. We can all participate today and just go through it together. The ratio of questions is similar to the exam. So you have, 3.5 hours to do 170 questions. Here, you could take about an hour to do 48 questions. So it kind of simulates the exam. So what we're going to do is just kind of rotate through these. And I'll start with number 1. You can put your answer in the chat. You can shout it out. You can raise your hand, whatever works for you, but we're just going to go through these as a group. So the first question, what type of zoning allows for a mixture of uses, promotes flexibility in density and design? Anyone have thoughts on this?
PUD.
Okay, Jeremy says PUD. So one of the things that we talk about, we always start with this question, and it always generates some dialogue around like, what is the test asking, right? So PUD is a really common response. And a PUD does do these things. It does allow for a mixture of uses and promote flexibility in design and density. But the key here is that a PUD is not a type of zoning, right? And so really thinking about, so similarly, TDRs are not zoning, right? So when you read this question, really think about, okay, the question is what type of zoning? You can kind of eliminate 2 of those automatically, right? And then it's like, is it pyramid? Is it overlay zone? And so it's a bit nuanced, but a PUD is really a process, right? It's sort of a type of development. So just really think about that as you're answering these questions. Okay, Morgan, you want to go, and then we'll just kind of rotate through?
Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the memorization questions that Erin had mentioned earlier. Who authored the image of the city? And y'all can unmute and throw out the answers. Okay, we have B. Excellent. That is correct.
And just to reiterate, like, this is a safe space, so we're going to have lots of wrong answers. We're going to have lots of discussion today. If you have questions, if you want to dive into like, hey, I thought it was this, not this, feel free to stop us. Not necessarily on this question, but should have said that in the beginning.
And we have another memorization question here. Who is the author of Silent Spring?
Hey.
Yep, that is correct, Rachel Carson.
So some of the things that we'll talk about during the tips and resources, you can mark questions. So let's say that you didn't know Rachel Carson was the author of Silent Spring. You might mark this and then come back later, and you in the course of your studying, you might look at what are influential people, and so you might know what some of these people are associated with. You might look at what are influential texts and movements, and so there's ways that you can sort of create a crosswalk for yourself and think about, I know Jane Jacobs did this, so I know she wasn't the author, just if you kind of get stuck. So just keep that in mind too.
I think one of the things that keeps coming up in like every like kind of course thing I go to like this is those are the ones that you really want to know, because some of them are going to be what's the best choice and what's this. So the factual ones that you can know are going to be the biggest ones to actually know.
That's a great point, Jeff. I think it's sort of frustrating to have to memorize things, and that's where flashcards or Quizlet or those types of things might come in handy, but you're absolutely right. You don't want to miss those gimme questions, where there's clearly only one right answer, because some of the other questions may be a bit more nuanced, like the first one that we started with, right, where you could get a little bit more tripped up. So try your best. I mean, it's one of those things, and we've talked about this before. You're going to memorize, 100+ law cases, right? And your exam might have 2. It might have 10. You don't know, but you just can't afford to let those one go. So I think that's a really good point. So this is I guess a math question, and I believe they still allow you to have a pencil and paper in the exam if you want to calculate things. You're not going to have to do we talked about the PE exam. You're not going to have to do super complex math and equations, but you might have to do something very simple. So this one, what is the floor area ratio of the building shown below, this 4-story building? Okay, so we have a B, we have an A, so Peyton, do you want to talk about how you got floor area ratio of B?
Yeah, I just kind of looked at the 4 stories, and if you kind of laid them out, it would take up the entire lot. So that's the one.
Right. So if this were 2 stories, then it would be 0.5, right? And if you have questions, folks that didn't get this one, floor area ratio, we can go through some of those. Just hit us up offline and we can give you some other practice. But essentially it's, how much of the lot are each of the stories covering, right?
Okay, another author or a book question. Which book did the father of regional planning write? And as a tip, it would be good to know who the author is of probably all of these books. But for this one, obviously needing to know who is considered the father. I'm getting a bunch of A, and the answer is A. So anybody can unmute, who is considered to be the father of regional planning?
Patrick Geddes.
Yes. Yep.
Good.
All right. What can be described as a budget that reflects one-time major expenditures to be used over a long period of time?
That's a capital budget. Maybe.
It is capital budget.
So Garrett, can you explain kind of what the difference is between maybe a capital budget and an operating budget?
Yeah, I would say the main difference is length of time. So operating is maybe over like a fiscal year or a calendar year. Yeah, I think long period of time is the key in this question.
Yep, good. And also the one time, right? And just for FYI, PPBS is Planning, Programming, and Budgeting System.
When would you use the PPBS again?
So I think that's really referring to a type of system that you would put into place, not necessarily a specific software, but really thinking about how you do budgeting, right? It's like how we would plan, how we would program, how we would budget for a specific project versus a specific type of budgeting, which is capital and operating.
Thanks.
And I'll be honest with you, I don't really know anyone that ever refers to a PPBS. That's not a familiar thing to me, having worked in the field for a few decades. I don't know, Morgan and Kate, do you have?
No, I was going to say that does make it kind of tough that there are going to be, different terminology on this exam that you may not be familiar with. So whenever those things come up, like right now, and Aaron's sharing, this is what it stands for, that may be something that you take a note, commit it to memory for the exam. You maybe never have to use it in your career, but as long as you know it for the exam, that's the plus. In my experience, I've only used capital budgeting and operating budgets.
Okay, I think I'm up. A successful strategic plan will focus on a limited issue, problem, or project, identification of a SWOT, outline resources that can be used to achieve identified goals, and do what else? Is that a recent B, Peyton? It is, right? Okay. So that is correct. So when you go through this, you know, all of these things are true about a successful strategic planning process. And in addition, it should have open democratic participation. So I think the key here is obviously A is probably out, right? There's not really that many things that we do in planning that are decided in closed session. Not that you don't do, you know, facilitated stakeholder groups, but and it could result in the need for enterprise funding, but it doesn't always. And then replace the existing comp plan. I mean, that's kind of a throwaway answer. You know, so that's something that I did when I took the test, is like eliminate the ones that are just automatically off the bat you're not gonna consider. And I mean, you're gonna still have a comp plan if you have a strategic plan that's addressing a specific issue.
Okay, a variance can be described as what? We're already getting some answers in. Yes, yes. Correct. With the rapid fire, I think it's okay to just say, yep, it's A. So this is, again, one of those things where it's just definition, memorization. For those who are municipal planners, this may be something that you're fairly familiar with in your practice. So, okay, any questions on this one? I will say that just being mindful of not, and I'll go over this more with the tips and resources, but not personalizing the questions too much. So in this question, just, you know, very simple, what is the definition? Because C and D include, oh, well, Board of Adjustment, Board of Zoning Appeals. Yeah, that may be something that your specific jurisdiction does. I know that 2 of the different cities that I've worked for in my career had them, but the one that I work for now does not, which drives me crazy. But personalizing it can be slippery slope. So just, you know, kind of taking yourself out of these questions whenever the time comes.
All right. Of the following growth management techniques, which would likely be used to reduce development density? I think the strategy that Aaron mentioned earlier of looking at maybe some of the answers that wouldn't apply is also a reasonable strategy for a question like this. Any thoughts? C, yep, that's right, large lot zoning. And so when you look at some of the others, so A and D, building permit moratoriums and building permit caps, while that may slow the number of units that are coming online in a particular jurisdiction, that's not actually affecting the potential density inside of a community, whereas large lot zoning would create particular standards to how buildings can be built and what those lot sizes can be, which would affect the overall number of developable acres and reduce overall density.
Okay, so for which of the following demographic groups would a mail survey instrument be most effective? Jerome, is this a current answer? Sorry, I'm having trouble. I think.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Correct. So seniors, typically mail surveys are most effective. And this may be changing, but I think that's probably still good sound answer here.
Okay, green infrastructure, ... Ooh, these are really fast. Yes, the answer is A. May reduce the impact of the heat island effect. I would say, are there any questions? But y'all, that was rapid fire. Okay.
Ooh, court case. In which case did the Supreme Court say that a community may prohibit unrelated individuals from living as a family in the same house? We've got a B with some question marks, maybe not sure, but you guys are correct. The answer is B, Belterra versus Boris, which is a 1974 case. For Jeff or Jerome, where you guys were questioning what it was, do either of you want to talk about how you arrived at that answer?
Yeah, I can. So I chose B because I do know that some of these kind of ordinances and regulations around unrelated individuals came around in the 70s. And out of these, one explicitly mentions of the 70s cases, the village of Belterre. So I assumed a village or a town or a city would be the one passing an ordinance for these things. So they would be one of the defendants or whichever they were in the case.
That's great. I think that's a really great strategy for test taking purposes, for how to kind of process and eliminate the answers if you're not sure what the cases actually were, or you haven't, if it's just game time and you're blanking, that those are some really great context clues for how to arrive at the answer. And so just for this particular case, so Village of Belterre versus Boris says, a zoning ordinance in the village of Belterre restricted one family dwellings to single family, which was defined as one or more persons related by blood, adoption, or marriage, living and cooking together as a simple housekeeping unit, or two people unrelated by blood or marriage. And so the Supreme Court found that it was appropriate for them to make and implement those rules.
And so as we're looking at the other choices, if you didn't know that, you might have known that Moore versus East Cleveland was a case found it was unconstitutional to prohibit a grandmother from living with her grandchild. So in that case, that one dealt with related individuals. So you could potentially, if you knew that, you could potentially strike that. Tennessee Valley Authority really was an Endangered Species Act case. And then in the last one, April versus Broken Arrow, it was really around takings. So you could kind of eliminate those last two. They didn't deal with housing and who can live in a home. So that would be another way to get to that. So this is a question that I don't know, Morgan, if we're at the point where we have 2020 census questions yet, since they haven't finished processing all the data.
Yeah, we're not.
Okay.
I would not anticipate having 2020 census questions on your exam.
So you wouldn't need to know, like, what's the average household size in Los Angeles. You're not going to need to know that type of information for the exam, but maybe some general trends, right? And as planners, these are probably things that you're aware of. So in 2010, the US Census revealed which of the following. Sorry about that typo, guys. Okay, B is what I'm seeing. And that is correct.
And just to reiterate what Erin said, for census stuff, I do recommend that y'all go to the census website, which is census.gov, and just look at the fast facts that they have for nationwide stats. Being familiar with, was there in-migration for this state, or why did another lose population? What has historically been, an area, there's always been a boom in population, those types of things. And like she said, you don't need to know the specifics of, oh my gosh, what is the household size for city of Colorado Springs? Kate can rattle off all that stuff because, as she mentioned, she's doing demographics for the city, but you do not need to know something so specific for particular cities unless it's like a large city that is studied often. And that's not me being like coy and giving you an answer, but I mean, just being mindful of that kind of thing.
Yeah, the other thing I would say that's helpful is to understand, like when I look at this question, even if I knew nothing about the 2010 census, I know that the decennial census doesn't ask any questions about income, and it doesn't really ask migration questions. So there's really only one answer that this could be, right? You know, if it said something about the American Community Survey or surveys that the census conducts, that would be different. But, you know, the decennial census asks about household composition and it asks about race and ethnicity, right? And so those are things that you would want to know, right? What are the surveys that the census conducts, the big ones, and what can they tell us? And to Morgan's point, you know, maybe which regions of the US are growing, which do we see losing those types of like larger thematic questions.
Well, that's me. Question 14. Okay, in drafting a neighborhood plan, what is the most efficient and effective way to ensure that the interests of all groups have been addressed? Oops. Well, as it shows on the screen, it is B.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm clicking around.
It's okay. That whole thing was confusing because I was talking, it was muted, and I thought, okay, this is just things are happening. The answer is what
happens when I have multiple things going on.
Exactly. We are doing our best. The answer is B. Does anybody have any questions about this one?
So this was tricky to me for a second, just understanding like the efficient and how weighing efficient versus effective. I'm sure C is sort of a distractor from the aspect of like, oh, it's super efficient to like send out a poll.
Mm-hmm.
How did you reach this answer? What's your thought process behind
Yes, excellent question. Unfortunately, with this exam, a huge thing to keep in mind is that there may be multiple correct answers in the same question, but you are to focus on what is the most correct. And recognizing that that is really tricky and maybe not the best approach. And so looking at how formatting questions can be improved, separate issue. So with this, there are some things where, well, that would make sense to do it, but specific to your question, talking about what is the most efficient. So thinking about, yeah, I could do these things, but is that really something that you're, you know, the expectation with drafting something like this is that you have a timeline. If I do these one-off things, am I going to reach the timeline and you know, with what is expected of me? Because yeah, you could do that, but is it really something that is going to be helpful? So with B, you could still have those groups that are mentioned in A participate in meetings so that you can discuss, what do y'all want to see in this plan? Same thing with C. So everything kind of feeds into B, where how can I capture the most people in one or two settings, talk with them, get the most information. And I hate to say this, but it's because it's not in sense of, you know, like being lazy about it, but really pulling in the prime stakeholders to get their feedback in one or two times, which thus results in being efficient.
The other thing that I would say is important in this one, and it's a little nuanced, but how are you ensuring that the interests of all groups have been addressed? And so to Morgan's point, in A, you may want to target specific groups, right? And you may want to do some additional outreach with specific groups. But if you're only sending the plan to specific ethnic, religious, and social organizations, you could be missing other segments. Similarly with C, if you're sending opinion polls to residents, what about workers? What about visitors? What about students? You know, you know, if you're conducting focus group meetings, in theory, you're kind of getting representatives from all of the groups together. So I think that's the other piece for me when I look at this is like, okay, if we're doing focus group meetings, we're getting a representative sample, right? So it's efficient, it's effective, and we're hopefully reaching most. So that's kind of, those are some of the ways that I would look at that.
Yeah. And then D, usually, you know, reading through all of the answer options. They're not every time, but there should be situations where you can just strike any option. D, the question is talking about whenever you're drafting the plan. D is saying, okay, we're going to hold a public hearing on the draft. Well, that jumped from, you know, A to X very quickly. So how did you get to that point? So you know that you can eliminate D.
I have a quick question on this.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to sidetrack it, but with C, it seems like a lot of times I've noticed that towns solicit feedback and get like public input from like an online survey or that kind of thing. But it seems like a lot of assumptions or a lot of weight is put to that, even though it may not be a scientific representation.
Yeah, and I don't know if you recognize this, but in your question, you said an online poll. Does that really capture everybody? Because who does or does not have access to the internet or a computer? So is that really something that is representative, as Aaron said, essentially a cross section of the population?
Right. Yeah, I think
So a
that's
lot of these you're thinking more than just what it says. Like, okay, well, how would I get to that? And again, like you said, an online poll.
I mean, realistically, a good planning process. I think if any of us, like let's say we're a consultant team, right? The 10 of us, our public engagement strategy would do every single one of these things.
Yes.
Right. We would do all of these things. And so, you know, I think, Jamie, that's a really good observation. A lot of people are relying on online surveys and putting a lot of weight into those. And I think, you know, that might be a good tool maybe to start to identify what some of the trends are. And then, hey, maybe we need to dive in and do a focus group because we know that, you know, there's a certain segment of our population that doesn't really go online. They don't follow the town's Facebook. They don't have access to, you know, there's a digital divide. I mean, I think those are all things that you would look at in your own community and kind of say, how are we going to make sure we're not relying too heavily on one specific tool? And I mean, I think, you know, some polls aren't statistically valid, some are. Those are determinations you have to make. But realistically, you know, we're going to do every one of these things, right, in a good planning process. All right, let's see if I can go to the next one without giving away the answer.
A planner's primary obligation is C. Yep. That is correct. To serve the public interest. Bonus question here. Who knows where this information comes from? Code of Ethics. That is correct.
Good job. Good job, guys. Okay, the intensity of residential land use is typically measured by which of the following methods?
I would say C.
Yep, good job. So when would you use floor area ratio, FAR?
I think that's just a measure of maybe building coverage or building density more broadly, not necessarily residential.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the key here is typically you use density when you're talking about dwelling units and in residential land uses. Communities oftentimes use FAR or other measures that aren't a per unit basis. So non-residential uses. So good job. Okay.
Okay. And I'm looking online to find the standard colors because we've had some questions on this one in the past. But which of the following best describes the composition of the block highlighted below? So looking at the different colors for how this is separated and what those colors are associated with in terms of land use. Give y'all a little time on this one.
I see 2 online answers that are different. Tell me when you're ready for me to do the big reveal, Morgan.
Let's do the reveal.
Oh, now I'm on the wrong screen. Okay.
So the answer is C. this is one of those very simple math, just kind of figuring out ratio here, but understanding what the colors are representative of. So typically green is going to be associated with open space or park. Yellow is going to typically be associated with residential. And in some cases that might be single family residential, but not all, but just knowing that yellow is residential. And red is for commercial, in this case, retail. Are there any questions on this one? Okay, while Erin and Kate go through their questions, I'm going to see if I can find a link just so that y'all can reference it for what those typical colors are, so you can study it if it's just something that you need some extra help with.
Was the key to this one like that bit about multifamily versus just residential, or just more so looking at it and seeing how much is there?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. So it is looking at what is there, but also counting those little blocks, assuming that they're all the same size. So with A, saying that it's 50% multifamily versus 25% park, 25% retail, well, you can tell that the green and red are not equal. And then B, those decimals, and that just seems overly complicated. And of course, wanting to check to make sure, like, is that right? But 75% would be the majority of that. And then looking at D, which might be what you're referring to, the multifamily versus park and retail. Still, park and retail, looking at this, you can tell that there's more park than the retail. So you can eliminate that one as well.
I would also say, in this, when you send out the typical color guides, in most cases, residential is sort of that orange, yellow, brown field of colors. Yellow all the way to brown, right? That spectrum. Typically multifamily would be a darker color on that spectrum. And so in this case, I would look to the more general, right? That's what I would look for in this, in addition to the kind of ratios. And Morgan just put that in the chat. Again, you don't need to memorize this, like what's the hue, what's the but just generally understanding, red is typically commercial or retail uses, green is typically parks and open space, that type of level of data.
All right, so the next one we have a stratified sampling is when you So we've got B in the chat. A. So the answer is A. Subdivide the population into at least 2 different subgroups that share characteristics, then draw a sample from each group. Honestly, I don't know how to describe this one, so I would probably look to Morgan to give more direction.
The difference here is really that you're dividing your sample into at least 2, potentially more groups, and then you're taking samples within those groups, right? Whereas B, I mean, you're still dividing the population, but you're randomly selecting those, and it's with a stratified sampling, you're saying, okay, like we have one group, let's say we have one group of older adults and we have one group of students, right? We're gonna separate those groups, and that they share characteristics of age, right? And then we're going to sample each of those groups. Wherein B, you're dividing the groups into 2, and then you're just taking a sample from that. So the difference is kind of the stratification, right? You're taking a group based on certain characteristics and sampling from those groups. Yeah.
So I put in a picture. I know that it's probably ridiculous, but here's a fun fact about me. I changed my major when I was a junior for undergrad. My a requirement for my entire major was geology. that has served me well, but maybe in this question it actually did. So when I think of stratified, I think of it as like a cross section of rocks, geology, so that you have the whole sampling and then you're doing like cutting through and seeing like, okay, pulling through what were everybody's responses, how does that look for part of the whole. So building off of what Aaron said, you know, this is something where we're looking at all of it. What makes the most sense for what I'm trying to figure out with my sampling. Hopefully that makes sense and didn't confuse anybody even more, but I thought maybe it'd be helpful if y'all could see that very scientific drawing of stratified rock sample.
Does that
Oh,
make
it's
sense
me,
to you guys
right?
before we go on?
Is it
Sorry.
me? What?
I think it's me, but does that make sense to everyone before we go on? The stratification, okay. What type of regulation would impose land dedication, growth management control, and land recordation? Okay, so we've got C and D. The correct answer is subdivision regulations. Any questions on that?
Hello, could someone please just go through the process of like eliminating why the other ones don't work? Thank
Sure.
you.
So I think ones that I would eliminate here, right? Parkland requirements. I mean, you could dedicate land during park requirements. You could also pay a fee. Parkland requirements that's not really a growth management technique. I mean, you can have open space as a way to control growth, but that's not really typically thought of as growth management. Conservation easement, you could potentially have some recordation. You would record an easement document. That certainly has some growth management techniques. That's not really a regulation in and of itself. You know, that's the other piece that I would think of is it's a conservation easement control isn't really a regulation. It's more of a program. Annexation is not, I mean, this is sort of nuanced. You know, so a community can choose not to annex and have that be sort of a growth management tool, but annexation does not really dedicate land. It brings land into a community, right? It's not really a growth management control. And certainly there are things you record in the process, but it's just not the best answer in this case. So this is one where you look at it and you'd say like, yeah, all A, B, and C, like there's elements of all of those that sort of hit on some of these things. But with a subdivision regulation, it's all about dedicating land. It's all about, I mean, you have to record, that's how you create lots, right? Is through a subdivision process. And then growth management control, right? You're figuring out how big are the lots, how dense are the lots, what are we requiring in terms of buildable and unbuildable. So all of those things are a part of subdivision regulation. So that's absolutely the best answer here. Does that make sense? I see a thumbs up. Okay. Any other questions on this one? This is a great example of like, yeah, I guess it could be, but then you see subdivision regulations and you're like, oh, obviously that's literally exactly what that is.
Okay, transportation planners, question 20, an LOSC, so level of service, at a signalized intersection indicates what? The answer is A, mostly stable flow, but speeds and maneuverability are somewhat constricted by the volume. Are there any questions on this one?
So we had a B in here. B would likely be a level of service A, or you know, I would look to a transportation planner to correct me, but
so I'm not a transportation planner, but I do have experience in land use review and learning a lot about LOS, and some of the key things that I think of with LOS is kind of like a report card. They kind of run through the alphabet and the report card A through F and lower. So A, you're thinking are like the best. There's really free flow traffic. There's not a lot of friction. There's not a lot of waiting. C is kind of like middle of the road. You mostly get it right and it's going well, but there are some things that you're maybe not doing, all the way, and it's causing some friction, it's causing some slowdowns, but still, we're still passing, right? And so I like to think of it like a report card. That's not like a really technical way to think of it. But that is something that I use as my own strategy to kind of figure out what those levels of service mean. And there's a question in the chat. Is the test going to cover more of LOS or VMT? So level of service or vehicle miles traveled.
It could cover both,
It
right?
could. Mm-hmm.
And so
we don't have an answer for if it's going to be more of one or the other.
You should be familiar with the concepts of level of service. And Kate, that was a great explanation. Morgan, I think you put in a resource here as well. You should also, know generally VMT, what are some trends, like as a community grows, would VMT increase or decrease? What is VMT? What is, how do people measure? The other concept maybe to be familiar with is volume to capacity, right? That's really what we use to, so we use VMT and V over C, or volume to capacity ratios, to calculate level of service. So all of those concepts kind of be familiar with, right? Again, you don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to even be a transportation planner, but you should be familiar with the concepts. Okay.
All right. A complete submission for a site plan review should provide each of the following types of information except. And we've heard this a few times, but again, making sure that we're not personalizing these questions to what your jurisdiction might do. Getting C's in the chat, and C is the correct answer.
That's a relatively easy one. Okay, which of the following best describes Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit? A is correct. So again, this is one of those questions, if you know who Clarence Perry is and that his concept was really that concept of the neighborhood unit, then you probably have a pretty good idea of what that looked like. And we've all seen that graphic, right? Any questions on this one? It's a relatively easy one. Okay.
Do y'all want to take a bio break? Okay. Is that okay?
Okay, so it's 10:20. Do you guys want 5 or 10 minutes? What works for people?
Maybe get a little snack.
5 minutes? Okay.
Okay.
We'll meet back here at around 10:25, okay? Thank you, Morgan. Okay, it looks like got most people back. So we will send out a PDF of this presentation with the answers highlighted. So if you missed something, don't worry, we'll email it out to this group along with our resource sheet, which we'll talk about in just a second. Let's jump back in, starting with landmark housing case. Am I starting this? You want me to start? And we'll just rotate through? Okay. I know it's only been 5 minutes, but I can't remember where we left off. So, so which of the following is considered a landmark housing case? Okay, we got a bunch of C's. That is correct. Does anyone want to talk about Southern Burlington NAACP versus Mount Laurel? So this case, just a little bit of information. The plaintiffs were primarily poor minority citizens who sought decent, low and moderate income housing, and they lived in substandard housing or had to move out because there just wasn't housing in Mount Laurel. So they argued that they excluded them through land use regulations. And so the findings of this case, why it was important is zoning as an action under police power can't be motivated by other considerations. If you're not sure on this one, some of the other things to know. So Hadachak versus Sebastian was a zoning case, not a housing case. Berman versus Parker, thank you, was a takings case. And then obviously most of us probably know that Euclid versus Ambler was also a zoning case. So even if you don't know, you know, kind of what the general, what was this case related to, you can kind of go from there.
Okay, which section of the Code of Ethics would one find the principles to which we aspire? We have one answer, yes. So section A, I would strongly recommend that y'all download the most current Code of Ethics. We've had some recent updates, but just become familiar with the different sections. So I will say that sections A and B are largely focused on how the expectation of how we conduct ourselves as professionals. C and D are mostly focused on, you know, what happens if you do something really bad, like Aaron said earlier. If you commit a felony, you do lose your AICP, which is maybe what is holding me to being a good person. I never want to take the exam again. But just being familiar with those sections, because these are also gimme questions. It's a lot of memorization, but I strongly recommend that y'all look into this.
And we'll include a link to that in our resource guide that we'll give you guys. Did someone have a question? Did I cut someone off?
All right. You are a newly appointed planning director in the small town of Buckville. Your husband is also the new owner of a gardening store that is applying for the construction of a large greenhouse to be built adjacent to the store. This will need to be reviewed by the Planning Commission for approval. In this example, you should do which of the following? D. That is correct.
So this is an example of sort of a scenario ethics question, right? Joanne, Jerome, Jeremy, how'd you guys get to this answer? Was it a process of elimination or?
Yeah, I'd say it also kind of felt like common sense just in general. And I also tie, because I know at my job, we do have, especially our council members, we do have to sign things about conflict of interest, and I'm limited in things I can do, especially politically, due to potential conflicts of interest. So at that context, I assumed it would be a very similar situation for this particular case.
Right.
Yeah, one of the big things that we're trained in from our legal at the city is particularly when there's any sort of like financial recourse involved or money exchange. So in this particular instance, it's there would be a more of a gray line. They could disclose if, like, let's say it was their best friend, but they wouldn't necessarily. Their best friend was building the greenhouse. Maybe they should disclose that, but the fact that it's her, their spouse, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, money is involved. It's a business decision and interaction. So that's the biggest red flag for recusing yourself.
That's a really good point, Jeremy. And so you could have had an option that did say something like that. And I would say, the code has a lot of language, and there's, potentially some gray area. So if one of the examples was, if it was about your best friend, even though you may not financially benefit directly, sometimes that perceived conflict of interest is also important to consider. But I think you're right. In this example, it's important that this person be removed, right? Because they do potentially have the ability to benefit directly. Okay, good job, guys. Who was the father of zoning? Okay. That is correct. Bassett. Anyone want to share with the group what the other folks were maybe known for? So again, just knowing these historical figures, right? Daniel Burnham, he did the plan of Chicago, really supporting the World Expo, kind of the City Beautiful, right? Batman was known for comp plans, particularly Cincinnati comp plan. He was also the lawyer in Euclid versus Ambler. And then Burgess was sort of credited with the concept of concentric circle planning.
Okay, which housing act focused on slum clearance? And you'll see that obviously there are several options here. Housing acts, well, I'll give y'all a little time and then I'll get into the spiel. I'm loving the confidence, but I very much understand why there are question marks. So with this question, the answer is C, Housing Act of 1949. There are many housing acts that were enacted, legislation at the federal level that guides what we do today as planners. So for those who are taking notes, with this question specific to 1949, federal financing for slum clearance, and this would have been associated with urban renewal projects. But as for the others, let me just open up my notes here. So 1954, created public housing. 1964 was the creation of the Fair Housing Act. So protections that all of us are probably very familiar with whenever we looked into housing in our respective jurisdictions, protecting the buyer or renter from discrimination. And 1970, the Housing Act was focused on raising the ceiling on guarantees for new communities. So making large scale projects feasible. Thank you, Erin. Yes, so we do have notes on our end. I did not have this memorized. Go ahead, Erin.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh, can we go back to the last one? I just had something I wanted to add. Yeah. I like to think of the housing acts, because these are most of the very important ones. And there can be a number of questions related to this on the test. And so one of the things about flagging questions that you might hear is like, oh, if you're not sure, maybe get a few more questions down the road. You might get another question that could eliminate one of these, something like that, if that's a strategy you want to use. But I like to think of the Housing Act questions as kind of like a building block that gets like a little bit smaller, like one of those like baby ring toys where it's like fat at the bottom and skinny at top, because like you wouldn't get public housing without clearing slums, right? If you start thinking in a like a historical context for how housing was considered. And so you get clearing the slums as the foundation, then you get affordable housing, and then there's the thought of like, oh, maybe we should create protections for all people to have access to fair housing. And then 1970 is sort of even more nuanced and more refined. And so it kind of creates like a triangle pyramid effect. And that's one of the ways I can kind of wrap my head around what all of them are.
Yeah,
that was amazing. I just learned from that. Thank you, Kate.
All right.
So, go ahead. Yep. Sorry.
What month has APA designated as National Community Planning Month? This is a bit of a deep cut if you guys don't follow APA too closely. Yep, the answer is D. It's October.
Okay. According to ITE's trip generation, how many trips, so average, how many trips per day per dwelling will be generated by single family homes? Okay, Scott is out the gate with A. Garrett, do you want to talk about maybe if folks aren't engineers or transportation planners, kind of what's some thinking behind this that could help?
I mean, the ITE trip generation manual just has data from a lot of different land uses and the actual traffic counts or trips generated by each type. Just a good rule of thumb is like for a single family home dwelling unit, it's around 10, exactly, I guess 9.52, but around 10 trips per day. I think that's probably the easiest rule of thumb to remember. I don't know if others may show up on this exam, but.
Yeah, so I think generally one of the things that we like to remember is as buildings get taller, so as things are denser, the number of trips can get smaller because people don't need to drive everywhere, right? And so if you're asked about this, no, a single family dwelling will generally generate more trips, potentially larger household size, those types of things. So just remember, as buildings get taller, trips get smaller.
Okay, who is involved with with an organizational approach that has invitations sent out by the neighborhood or organization, and a paid organizer is then sent to the neighborhood? So who created that concept? So maybe this is not something that y'all have gotten to in your studies, which is very okay. You're torn between A and B. So the answer is B. Old Saul came up with this concept. Whenever Aaron was going through the different sections of the exam, this is focused on public participation. So being familiar with those who came up with various concepts. We had a question earlier about the concentric method, but being familiar with those because it is a significant portion of the exam and a lot of memorization. Yay.
And I think the key with Saul Alinsky is really paid organizers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
What does zip code
Um,
stand for? Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry, before we go to 31, can we go back to 30 and
Yeah.
just go through the process of elimination exercise?
You know, I will have to Google,
Same.
Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about Paul Davidoff? Because I know you said you were torn between the two. I think the key is, again, the paid organizing piece. I don't think any of these other folks really focused on that, on the paid organization piece.
So it sounds like, just trying to help myself understand, it sounds like this question is trying to pinpoint like who out of these four their big thing was about this concept. So I was a little confused. I ended up picking A, because I thought that this was a part of advocacy planning. But and I ended up I couldn't remember what TJ Kent did. Sorry, TJ. And Ornstein's ladder didn't seem to apply, so I eliminated C. Saul, I completely forgot what he did, respectfully. So Saul's big thing is paying organizers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Neighborhood organization, paid organizers, you know, inviting the neighborhood to participate. And yes, I'm going to honestly have to Google Kent as well. It looks like, apologies to TJ Kent, but has not made an impression on this group, including me.
I Googled it, so I already cheated. He's in the 100 Essential Books of Planning with APA. He wrote in 1964 the Urban General Plan.
Okay. So not involved. So again, to your question on process of elimination, you know, ladder of doesn't necessarily apply. Thinking about general plans, that's not really neighborhood organization. And then thinking, okay, Saul was really all about paid organizing. That's how we're going to do it. Thank you, Morgan.
And this is one of those that, you know, being familiar with the important names of the history of planning and, again, memorization. So the way, whenever I was prepping for the exam, put flashcards together and just wrote, you know, all of the key things that somebody may have done. So this is part of, you know, just memorization and becoming familiar with who these characters are and what they may have focused on, because the question could have been, who was involved with Rules for Radicals, and then it would still be that answer, but this is, you know, more something else that he did. So going through and just kind of, it's not fun, of course, but just being super familiar with all of the different characters and planning.
So one of the things that we have on our website, I know when I took the test, and this will be slightly outdated, but we put it on the web, is kind of history of planning. So terms, people, cases. Certainly the cases is a bit out of date with anything recent. But you're welcome to look at that document and just I made flashcards, you know, so Saul Alinsky, what did he do? Paul Davidoff, you know. So we have kind of terms, history, people, and there's some documents on our website. There's probably some flashcards now that you could use through Quizlet and Flash, whatever the other, we'll talk about what those are. But just get yourself familiar, you know, create mnemonic devices or whatever's going to work for you.
What does zip code stand for? A. Yep.
I don't think we need to talk about that one. That's probably a easy one. Okay, so we have another scenario. One of the things that we have been made aware is that with the way the test is revised, there may be questions that deal with, you'll get a scenario and there'll be maybe multiple questions that deal with that. And so, you know, taking time to read those, making sure you understand the nuance, picking out those kind of key things. In this case, you're a village planner and you're going to attend a plan commission meeting to provide a staff recommendation on a specific planning commission case. Prior to the meeting, you receive a phone call from a friend and colleague who's a planner in a nearby community. She tells you she has some dirt on the petitioner that's scheduled to present on this case. And she says you won't believe your ears. And although the information's confidential, you have to hear it. So you're afraid this could impact your recommendation. What should you do in this case? And here's your choices. Okay, so it looks like people think you should tell her that if she has anything to say, she should come and say it during the public comment portion of the meeting that night. And that is the correct answer. So again, you're already concerned. It's confidential. You don't need to listen to you don't want to listen to what she has to say. You don't want her to tell you face to face. Well, maybe you do want to know. Maybe you're curious, but you shouldn't. So you're not going to do either of those two things. And then really, you're already at the case. If it's confidential information, if she's a AICP, if she's a planner, she probably really shouldn't be sharing it with you. So that's something for her to consider. But you're not going to present that during the executive session because it's not relevant to the case. It doesn't sound like it's not part of the finding. So she should come and talk during public invited to be heard.
Okay. An environmental impact statement can be defined as which of the following? The answer is B. Yes, written to satisfy requirements of NEPA when a major action will have a significant impact on the environment.
So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right. Yassi, is that how you pronounce your name?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, we've had this question in the past, and do you want to talk a little bit about why it wouldn't be A or C?
Sure. Sorry, I have to read A and C again. It's a list.
Or why
well, if I remember correctly, an EIR is not with NEPA. I'm in California, so an EIR is something that would be under the California Environmental Quality Act. The lesser version, I guess I'm an environmental planner, so I just at this point it's like inherent in my head, but an EIS is like the biggest environmental document you can do under NEPA. I was about to say less big, but the slightly smaller one that you would do is called an environmental assessment.
Correct.
So the first option, I think you would just need to know, well, I think the trick here is that they're throwing EIR in there. And so if you have your NEPA glasses on, you would see that, okay, that's not a thing under NEPA. For C, written to satisfy requirements when a government is expected to have no impact. If it's expected to have no impact, that's actually called a different document. That's called I believe that's a FONSI. So it's a finding of no significant impact. So I think at the end of the day, this is one of those memorization questions where you just have to understand that an environmental impact statement is what you write when there's like a really, really big impact that could have a really significant, I should say, impact on the environment, and the other two are different documents.
That's exactly right. And so I think the key here, you can eliminate C because you wouldn't do an EIS if there was expected to have no impact, right? You wouldn't need to do an EIS. You do an EA and call it a day. And similarly, A, it's less extensive to your point. So really the only answer that fits here is B, because you do an EIS when there is expected to be a significant impact. So that's a good, thank you for that clarification. And great to know we have an environmental planner. So for folks, I know you joined a tiny bit late. We've got some transportation folks, some kind of generalist engineers, landscape architect background. So this is a good group. So if you guys, want to form a virtual study group, it sounds like you've got a lot of expertise on the call today.
uses and structures that exist prior to the zoning ordinances and are not in conformity with its provisions are known as, we've got some C's, and C is the correct answer, nonconformity.
Sorry, I'm just gonna go ahead and correct this because I don't know what happened. Sorry about that, guys. Any questions on this one?
Yes, unfortunately, I kind of took a blind guess with this one. Could we walk through
Sure.
what these all are? And
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the key here, Kate, do you want to take this? Sorry.
No, go ahead. You got it.
So I think the key here really with non-conformities, so non-conforming uses or non-conforming structures, you can have either, right? Really the key is that those exist prior to something else, right? So prior to creating a law, we had something that was okay. And now because of something that came after, it's no longer, doesn't fit, right? It doesn't conform to the current rules. And so the key here is that it existed prior to the ordinance or code, and it's not in conformity. So it's okay, but it's non-conforming. Provisional allowance, that's not really a term I'm super familiar with, but it doesn't fit. It doesn't deal with anything related to something existing before a code. This could potentially be like a secondary use or something that's allowed in specific cases. Is that?
Yeah, it's like conditional.
Yeah. A code enforcement case, you could have a code enforcement case that's looking at a non-conforming use, but that's not relevant here. Code enforcement deals with non-conformities all the time. I'm sure that's a big portion of their job, but it's not a code enforcement case in and of itself is not a use or structure, right? That just doesn't make sense. And a retired zoning use could create a non-conformity, but it in and of itself isn't a use or structure, right? And so thinking about the semantics of this, non-conformity is really the only thing that fits. And just know, again, a non-conforming use or a non-conforming structure is something that existed either under a previous code or potentially even before a code was written, right? Something was built in 1900 and the city didn't adopt their first zoning code until 1912, right? Or whatever. Does that help you?
a little bit. I think this is another memorization question. Thank you.
Maybe another thing to think about, not the answer nonconformity is like the most succinct and probably accurate way, but it's quite oftentimes used just as Aaron was saying, as like non-conforming structure, non-conforming use, or in our municipal code, it'll say like illegal non-conforming structure, which puts a whole new like spin in your brain. So if you'll just have to memorize it, yes, but maybe some of those context clues is like a lot of times somebody comes in and is it a legal, we'll have them register their legal non-conforming structures so that we have a record in the city of whether or not it was done legally in the past. We have to go back through records and look at those things. So there are some words that surround this that help probably give your brain some better context and make it more obvious. But so just one other thing to think about.
That's a great tip, Jeremy. And I think, if you're not a person working in local government, like Yasi, I know you said you're an environmental planner. This probably isn't something you come across because this is very much a municipal county, something that will exist in a code. And most zoning codes have a whole chapter or section on nonconformities. So the other thing that is important to know, and I don't know what the questions around this would be, but you could have something like, when would a use that's not allowed under a current code be allowed to be reestablished, right? Well, to Jeremy's point, if it was a legally non-conforming use and it was destroyed through no fault of the property owner, they can be reestablished, right? And so there could be some things around that. So you may just want to Google or kind of look through some of the study guides around non-conformities and kind of provisions around some of that, because that's a pretty it's a pretty specific thing, but it's pretty important from a municipal or county planning perspective. Okay, next question.
Okay, the polycentric concept can be described as which of the following?
Got a B?
Yes, I was going to say, and Jerome is our answer. Yes, so metropolitan regions developed into a series of centers. So with this one, the question says polycentric. So understanding what that root word is and how it would be applied. Answer is B. Okay.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. A planner experiences what may be violation of the AICP Code of Ethics. Who should they contact for advice? C, ethics officer. That is correct.
And just know, to kind of build on this, the ethics officer is really the only one that's authorized to give formal advice on an ethics complaint. So you may talk to your supervisor, you may talk to HR, you may talk to me or our chapter president, but we're not authorized. I can hear you out. I can, be a friend, a friendly ear, whatever, but we are not authorized to give you ethical advice. Only our ethics officer is. And so that's just a good thing to know as you become AICP. Okay. A strip of mostly level land bordering a stream or river that's subject to flooding is known as what? All right, we've got some answers coming in quickly. That is correct. That is known as a floodplain.
The policy Delphi method can be defined as what? The more of that public participation, recognizing different theories, as mentioned earlier, characters of planning. Yes, Peyton, the answer is A, successive rounds of argument and counter argument that work towards a consensus.
Any questions?
Which can also be known as compromise. I mean, I'm sure that many of you utilize this in your day-to-day without even realizing that you could equate it to one of these methods.
Okay, next question. A walkable residential development with a diversity of housing types, density of more than 6 dwelling units per acre with access for vehicles and pedestrians is known as what type of development? Okay, we have one answer in. So this is one we usually talk about. The answer we have is submitted so far is B. The answer is actually C. Jerome, do you want to talk about why you thought it was new urbanism?
So the reason why I chose B over C is they didn't directly mention transit, and my understanding at least of TOD is that it is geared towards nearby transit, whether that be BRT, bus stop, subway, but they never explicitly mention. So to me, it felt like new urbanism was the better fit. I was tripped over the density question because I did sound like TOD, but it felt strange to have that be the answer without mentioning that there's a transit station nearby.
I'm with you there.
Yeah, so I think this is one of those. The key here is really that transit supportive density. And actually, when I think this is one of the new questions, I had always heard 7 and I was like, oh, should I change it? It's whatever. I think the point is that it's really talking about that transit supportive density. Morgan, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, so this was pulled we've been using a lot of older test questions. And so with some that were formatted in a way that we're trying to get away from, this had originally been written as a transit-oriented development is known as, and then listed out different options. And the answer was 1 and 2, 2, 3, 4, all of the above. So I took everything that was in the correct answer and just threw it into this paragraph. So nothing was changed, but like Erin said, this is always something that we have talked about in the past when we've done these workshops, because it is kind of confusing. New urbanism, I'll say that I threw that in, and I'll probably never do that again because it confused y'all. So this is intended to be specific to transit-oriented development, with the development being mindful of both pedestrians and vehicular traffic. But being something that is focused on, yep, we can still have transit within this development. So again, it's just something that we'll have to be more clear about. Pulling it from those older questions is a little tricky.
I think the other thing, Morgan, that you could say, so I would agree with Jerome and Jeremy, like this kind of does describe an approach to new urban, right? It fits.
Absolutely, yeah.
But maybe the way that I would say, why is TOD a better answer? Because it's specifically asking for a type of development, right? And when I look at this list, I'm like, okay, we only have 2 types of development called out.
Yeah.
So that's really nuanced. This isn't a test question.
No,
but I think the key takeaways here, if you're, okay, what should I know for the test? What are densities that generally support transit? You have to have a specific threshold, right? If you want to support transit. What does TOD, the other thing that used to really trip people up with the way the old question was written is the inclusion of vehicles, right? And TODs should plan for vehicles and pedestrians and transit and. So I think those are kind of the key takeaways, right? That TOD plans for all multimodal options, that it includes a variety of residential types, that it has a minimum floor of density. So maybe those are some takeaways, and we'll maybe revise this question a little bit for next time.
And you know what's funny? The original question was 4 DUs per acre. Oh so gosh. I think that all around we were just dealt with not a very good question.
We'll work on this one a little bit. If you guys have ideas, shoot those over to us. Okay, next question.
These are deep lakes that have low supply of nutrients and thus contain little organic matter.
In a previous, I don't remember when it happened, but somebody talked about, is it oligarchy? Yeah, oligarchies. And so looking at the root word, maybe this will be helpful.
Yasi, do you have any thoughts on this one from an environmental perspective? Is this something that you're familiar with in terms of those root words?
I was hoping you wouldn't call on me. I was taking a guess with this one.
That's okay. Yeah, so again, this is kind of a definition, and I think, I don't recall exactly, but I think when you break up those words, trophic and oleogo, you can kind of get to that definition, but it is A.
So this would be one to me. Can you expand on just like how far the tentacles reach? I mean, this feels very like environmental sciences, or does it feel like a stretch for the, obviously not, it's on here for AICP, but how deep should we dig into areas like this? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it seems really esoteric, or
yeah, you're not going to become a environmental scientist to take the AICP exam. So I would say, understand some general definitions. This is, Morgan just put in here, this is an adjective. I think it's something, you know, if you can sort of understand the basics of like ecology, environmental planning, I mean, frankly, you're not going to be able to know everything. This test covers so much, right? I probably wouldn't spend a ton of time trying to memorize every term that you could for environmental planning. I think if you can start to understand maybe some of the root words and think about, you know, as you think about like maybe some of the geography terms, glacial geography, like maybe pick a few things and try to understand some common things around physical planning, environmental planning. But yeah, I mean, at some point you're gonna have, to your point, like you're not gonna know what all of these are in a deep way and be able to give a lesson on them.
Yeah. Is there a particular source document that something like this would come from in the suggested study materials? You know?
So
Yeah.
I would say that in questions like this, what I strongly recommend is that if you're thinking like, what the heck is this? I've never heard of it, really Googling. And then if you find a resource where like, oh my gosh, this has everything that I need in it, then utilize that. Which I know is such like a loosey-goosey response, but there is a component of science, as you know, we have environmental planners, and there's also, as I mentioned earlier, the focus on root words and being familiar with the Latin of that.
Yeah, so we'll give you some resources and you can kind of look and see, like when I'm thinking, you know, when you're studying for environmental planning type things, physical planning, where are some good resources? We'll connect you to those. The other thing we can do, we do have a certified environmental planner on our board. We could ask her if she took the test a long time ago, but if she's got some good tips of like where to study for, and we can send that out to the group.
Yeah, thank you.
Is it me? I think.
Go.
Stats question. What is the range of the following data set? So we'll give you a little time. Yay. Yes, the answer is D. So being familiar with range, median, mode. Okay.
So those are, Jeremy, just to kind of put your mind at ease, because I don't want to stress you out about the previous question. These are more of the types of questions that I would be familiar with, right? Like how do you, to Morgan's point, how do you calculate these things? What do they mean? These are, you know, probably more relevant to our profession, right?
Yeah, that's fine. And thanks for the input. I just trying to get a sense of what all I should capture. That was one that was a red flag in my brain. Like, is there twice the amount of information out there that I'm missing and really need to be delving into, or is it kind of you're gonna miss some, it's gonna be a pick and choose, some of will be in your expertise and some will not?
No, and I appreciate that question. I don't want anyone to get really nervous that, oh my God, I don't remember this from, you know, high school, or because it's not something that is intuitive to several of us. After we get through, we have less than 10 questions left. We'll get through tips and resources for some additional study guides and recommendations so that everybody will feel more well-rounded in their studies.
And there are different exams, you know, so I've heard some folks that say like, gosh, my exam had a lot of transportation questions, and then talk to someone that took an exam at the same time and said, I had none. So, you know, just kind of try to do as much well-rounded studying as you can to prepare yourself. Yeah, Yasi.
I also just wanted to mention that in regards to that last question, that sounded like a question that would fall under the theme of areas of practice, which is about 12% of the test.
Yeah.
So, and within like I think on the APA website, they had like a very long bulleted list of like what could be covered under this area of practice question. And the range is extensive, from like transportation planning, infrastructure planning, to sustainability and resilience, really everything under the sun when it comes to areas of practice. So just thinking about the probability of this question coming up compared to other questions that in my point of view, I need to be spending more time studying on, like especially law, especially ethics. Like I'm going to be personally stressing out more about those and less about this type of question that may come up. I hope that helps.
I think that's really sound advice. Okay, next question, Kate, I think this is you.
All right. This can be described as a device to provide flexibility within a zoning ordinance. We've got a lot of C's.
So this is a tricky one. Just everyone kind of read the question and key in on that flexibility within the code.
We've got some A's. The answer is A. No,
So does anyone want to, that, you know, maybe Nicole, Jamie, Jerome, because this is something that comes up almost every single time we do this, the difference between A and C. Do you guys want to talk about why you chose A over a variance, which also provides relief?
Yeah, so I chose A because of the wording within the zoning ordinance. And I'm not a land use planner. We don't do land use at all. But what I do know from a lot of land use ordinances, codes, and all that is there are quite an extensive use of permits. So when I saw within the zoning ordinance, I immediately thought for any sort of flexibility or something that's not in the code, you would need to get a special permit to do that.
Yeah, I'd kind of back that up. I think it's nuanced, but it comes down to within the zoning ordinance, which is what would be a special use permit, whereas a variance is almost outside the zoning ordinance, so to speak. So
that's correct. And I also think, again, a little nuanced, but a variance doesn't provide flexibility. A variance provides relief, right? So it provides relief from a hardship. A special use permit provides flexibility. Do you have a question, Yossi, or a thought? Or is your hands up from before?
No, sorry, I forgot.
That's okay.
Lower my hand.
I just want to make
Thanks.
sure we weren't losing anything. Okay. Okay. A public meeting is being hosted by a local jurisdiction to discuss a potential new development. How could a planner best communicate to interested parties? What would be the best way? Okay, so D, correct. And again, like you'd probably do most of these things, right? You'd probably do all of these things, but if you're trying to figure out what's the best way to communicate to interested parties, it's really targeting those residents within the project vicinity. Okay.
This type of land use can be described as being allowed by right. Yes, the answer is C, permitted use.
So for any of our friends that aren't local planners or land use planners, do you all know kind of what the difference is with the other uses? Any questions on this before we go to the next one? Good, okay.
Which of the following could describe the term earned value?
Any thoughts on this one? All right, let's do the big reveal.
I don't really know how to describe the difference between any of these.
So I think what this is really getting at is, you know, earned value. How much how much work have you done to get to a point within the progress against where you're anticipating going? This is sort of one where you could also eliminate, you know, and you can think of other terms of, you know, I think that this is kind of trying to throw you off by putting a bunch of budget stuff in here. But, you know, you think about like earned media or some other terms where it's like you're doing work to get to something else. And this is really talking about how much work have you done to make progress on the plan. I mean, earned value, it's not what a project should be bid at. It's not related to profit. That would just be simply profit. So again, it's just something to know. It's a method for measuring against progress of a plan. Again, this isn't a term, I mean, I've never heard anyone refer to this term in the profession. So it's maybe a little bit outdated.
One question, would this
Yeah.
fall under, would the previous answer fall under plan implementation in terms of like where we're studying?
I think so. Yeah. So if again, that's a kind of a good point. If you're thinking about like how you study, you know, what are the ways that you, what are some ways you can measure progress on plan implementation, right? This might be one way. And so thinking about, you know, as you're focusing, maybe Googling like how, you know, methods for measuring plan progress, right? There could be different tools and ways that you do that. So yeah, I would say this would be under plan implementation. Okay, exactions can be defined as what?
I think this one is C.
C is correct. So again, this is a definition, right? What is an exaction? Another way that you might learn about this or know about this is by some of the legal cases, right? When are exactions legal and not legal? But really this is what is someone going to require a developer, a subdivider to pay for public improvements associated with the development. So there's a few cases, legal cases that deal with this. You know, what's the nexus between what's required and what's being asked? But just know that exactions are really the amount of money that someone's going to pay for an improvement, a public improvement associated with a development. So again, even if you don't know what it is, maybe looking at some of the other, we know exactions are with the developer or the private party, not the city. Those are public improvements, right? The city's not going to necessarily usually pay for private improvements. B is sort of not relevant at all, and neither is D. Those just don't, those two answers don't really make sense. I would put exactions on my list of terms. Just be familiar with what they are. And if you're not in local government, that's probably not something that you necessarily deal with.
Okay, what is a disadvantage to shift share analysis? Any guesses on this one? The answer is A. So it does not discount the effect of abnormal events. I'm going to put from our notes, the note that we have, share it with y'all. So the reason that this is A, y'all can read along. Shift share analysis evaluates the strengths and weaknesses of a specific region's industries. It shows how well the region's mix of industries are performing and how well those individual industries, oh, it says it twice. This analysis examines three components of regional employment, there's like a little icon that I can't read it. Growth, so natural growth, industry mix, and competitiveness between 2 periods of time. These 3 components are added to obtain the total change in employment of a specific industry. So from this, it looks like it's very cut and dry. This is data comparison. So with it being A, the reason that is the correct answer is that it just compares data. So there's not that factor of anything strange happening that was unexpected. You know, we could use everybody's favorite example that we had a pandemic. So comparing different industries within the region, nobody could have fathomed that that was going to happen. You could have considered that to be an abnormal event. Because I think this is something that is focused, and I'm not putting you on the spot, Erin, but I feel like this is something that from the economic development perspective, there might be like a little something that you could sprinkle in for explaining this one, maybe?
Yeah, and I think, you know, this question at its root, even if you don't, I mean, this isn't something probably most planners use in their day-to-day jobs. But now that you know what shift share analysis is, the rest of the answers talk about what it is, right? It's not a disadvantage. This is what it does. It evaluates strengths and weaknesses of specific industries and how well those industries are performing. So I think if you kind of by knowing what it is, you can eliminate some of those. And I think, you know, obviously, COVID's a great example. I think, you know, a flood could be another example, a fire, you know, some of those things that we've had locally. You could see regions doing really well in some things, you know, my gosh, our building materials, like we had a lot in construction and like that did really well. Well, it did really well because everyone had to rebuild, right? So I think, yes, this probably falls under those areas of practice. It could also fall under sort of the data piece, right? And how you're measuring, how you're evaluating from an economic perspective. The test isn't going to ask you to conduct a shift share analysis or anything like that. You know, you could have a question that, you know, what are ways that you could evaluate strengths and weaknesses of regional industries, right? And then you would know like, okay, a shift share analysis is that. What are, you know, we might use location quotients to understand specific strengths of a specific industry. So just being familiar with some of those terms from an economic development perspective. Okay, last question.
Transfer of development rights, or TDRs, do which of the following? Okay. D. Yep, the answer is all of the above. So TDRs do all of the following things. I think
Any questions on this one? And I don't know how much the test, you know, I think in the 80s and 90s, growth management was such a big topic in planning, right? And so people really thinking about TDRs, PDRs, conservation easements, all of those types of growth management techniques. You know, so just being kind of familiar with the concept. If you're in Colorado, there's some pretty innovative TDR programs that exist in our state. Those are have been successful. I mean, Boulder County is probably the best local example of that. But just kind of being familiar with how those work and what the purpose of those are. Anyone have questions on this one? Okay. So we're going to shift. We'll spend the next few minutes talking about tips and resources, and then we can open it up for questions.
Okay, so this is my favorite part of the training. It's providing additional information for y'all for how to be successful in your studies for the exam. With this first slide, we are assuming that y'all are familiar with this, but if you're not, that's very okay. So going to APA's website to review what all of the expectations are for those who are taking the AICP. They have a full guide that you can download and read through it. And also being sure that you register for the exam. So some of you said that you're maybe taking it in spring, maybe fall, undecided, very okay. Register whenever you're ready for it. So there is no pressure. I will say that I didn't register to take the exam until well after I met the expectations. I was just a little nervous, had a push from a planner friend and did it. So this is very much what you want to do. So, you know, just as like a personal thing, don't let anybody pressure you to do something you don't want to do. But if you have questions about the specifics for what this looks like, check out this document on APA's website. Next slide. Sorry, it's okay. So we've talked about this a few times this morning. Hopefully this exam was a good temperature check for y'all, that if you were able to get through the exam before today and recognizing that maybe you didn't have enough time, that's absolutely fine. That the discussion, you were able to kind of gauge where you feel comfortable, where you think maybe you sit, talking a little.
Uh-oh, did Morgan freeze for you guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, we'll give her a
Morgan.
second.
Focus your efforts in how to best set yourself up for studying. So Erin mentioned this a few times. Can y'all still see me? I just got a notice that said that my internet was unstable. Okay.
You froze for a second, but you're back.
Okay, good. Make your own flashcards. The operative word there is your own. If you're comfortable with doing that, if it's something that you want to do, because there are a lot of resources out there where you can essentially download flashcards, print them, cut them out, glue them to whatever. But if you want to make your own, because something that works for me, if I'm physically writing it, it helps with my memorization of whatever that fact is. And maybe find an online study group. So not wanting to pressure anybody on this study session, but if y'all want to get together and study together, the great thing, and I feel kind of gross saying this, the great thing that came out of the pandemic is that we're able to use technology in a way that maybe we didn't before. So some of y'all are in California, some of you are here. So if you want to study together, you absolutely can. But let us know if you want to get plugged in with a study group, because we can also help you with that. Next slide. So I didn't intentionally skip one of those bullets. I knew that it was going to come up here. Strongly recommend that y'all go through slide our little Brady Bunch pictures over. So using practice tests and quizzes. If you are using Planetizen or APA, for example, for your study guides, and they give you the test and at the end, you know, grade it and tell you what the score is, please do not let that discourage you. Those practice exams and quizzes are intended to be more difficult than the actual exam is. So if you're finding that maybe you're not doing as well as you'd hoped, maybe you're failing them, I will tell y'all, I failed every single one of them, but I took the exam and I passed. So use that as an additional way to study whenever you're using those practice exams and quizzes. If there's a question, we mentioned this today, terms that you are not familiar with, Google it, write notes all over those tests and exams. Again, if that's something that you find to be helpful, looking through the things that I printed out, they're covered in notes because it was stuff that I just had never heard of, wasn't familiar with, knew that it was something I needed to focus more of my attention on. And with that, many of you said, I didn't go to school to be a planner. I'm not working for a jurisdiction. My education background is my bachelor's in landscape architecture, master's in development. I didn't know I was going to be a planner until my final year of grad school. Studying for this was scary because I didn't go to school to specifically be a planner. So I thought, I'm going to fail. I have no idea what I'm doing. But with that, as was shown on the previous slide, I identified what I knew and what I didn't, and I focused more on the things that I didn't know. With that, so when you're going through those practice tests and quizzes, please do not memorize those questions. They're intended to kind of get your brain thinking about the types of questions that will be on the actual exam. Don't personalize the information. So there are some ways that maybe you're able to put into practice what makes sense for your jurisdiction or your office, wherever you may work. If it makes sense that, well, I know what this means, that's okay, but just being mindful of the fact that there are some jurisdictions that have same processes with different names. So not wanting it to be, if I were to take it today, I wouldn't want it to be something where, oh, the city of Colorado Springs uses this type of permit and it means blah, blah, blah. Using more of the context clues and your familiarity from your studies of what that may mean. Okay, next slide. Okay, so more resources. This is obviously link heavy. APA National has a lot of resources on their website, and I went on recently. They have, for their AICP page, they have some additional videos now, which are really helpful. So you'll be able to go in there for AICP, find study guides, and they have drop downs. I think there's 7 maybe of them that you can go through, and they have videos and additional resources. Regarding the state chapters, there are many states in our country that have some really great resources out there. Someone mentioned that they've been using Henry's study workshop in Florida. That is a great resource. It's something that we've always touted whenever we've done this workshop specifically. Ohio has amazing resources, Pennsylvania, Texas. So just kind of exploring those different chapter sites to find the resources that they may use for prepping for the exam. Erin is our professional development officer. So a PDO, she knows some of the PDOs for other states. All the states are taking the same exam. So nobody has anything that's specific to where they are, but saying that because it might be something great to explore different states and their resources. Yes, Yasi, Georgia has really good resources also. Thank you for saying that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so specific topics. So Erin went over how the exam is now broken down, and we kept saying now it looks like this, and versus, so many of you may be thinking, what are you talking about? What did it look like before? When the 3 of us took the exam, there were less categories, which may sound like a cool thing, but it very much overwhelmed me because there were different sections that 30% of the exam was focused on it. But with what is on the screen here, a lot of these topics are pure memorization. So history, looking at Supreme Court cases, who are the figureheads of planning? What are some of the major theories of planning? Looking at it from the perspective of straight up memorization, something that I could not stand my dad saying to me when I was in high school, and US history, and I would say, but I don't understand why this happened. He's like, oh my gosh, you don't necessarily need to know like all of the details, just know that it happened, memorize it. So that's something that I think of where, well, what were they thinking? Don't go down that rabbit trail. Just memorize the facts of what happened. And if it is something that you need some additional support in, obviously reach out, how to memorize or the best way to focus on Supreme Court cases, because there are some where it might be focused on the First Amendment, 14th, a takings, and wanting to be maybe to organize your studies on what that focus is. We mentioned that ethics, that is going to come straight from the Code of Ethics. It's not a big section of the exam, but those are really gimme questions. So knowing where something came from, is it section A, is it B? What happens if I do rob a bank? You're not going to have AICP anymore, but just going through and memorizing those sections, not to overwhelm y'all, but something that I did because I took it from the suggestion of people who took the exam before me, memorizing the entire code of ethics. Remember that you're doing this for one exam. And when you pass and you're done, a lot of that information can just go. You will end up applying a lot of it. Some of you may have already recognized that whenever you are studying, you're able to apply some of the things that you're learning to your profession. But knowing that you're doing it for one goal and, using that brain power for this specific goal. Next slide. Okay, so study resources. Yes, we are here today talking about the exam, but there are some other resources online. APA exam prep and Planetizen are not free, but if you feel like this would be something that would be largely beneficial to you, I would encourage you to do it. I did the Planetizen study session. It was, I think, $275 when I did it, but it was something that I found to be very helpful. So those different categories, and I'm not making a plug for them, just wanting to share my own experience because it's very much up to you what you feel comfortable doing. The way that that study session was divided up was based off of how the exam is divided. So there may have been, at the time it was obviously a little different, but now it would be, a huge chunk of it focused on public participation. Another is, okay, what are the main facts that you need to know about history? So it really followed the breakdown of the actual exam and some of those, not some of them, but a lot of the things to study and focus on. It had videos, the practice exams and quizzes, and some downloadable fact sheets. Again, it's completely up to you if you want to do that. There are other resources that are free, which Planning Prep is one of them. So there's multiple practice exams available. And please know that they are quite out of date, but the intent of going through them is just to get you comfortable with what the format of those questions will be. Next slide. Okay, YouTube. Not just APA Colorado. So if you look down, you see the fifth square is one of our recent trainings. We have saved all of these exam preps on our YouTube channel. Other states have theirs. If you go to YouTube and just search AICP, you're going to come up with a lot of resources, which is really great. Most of them are several hours long, kind of like today. But if you just need to hear more people talking about the things that you're studying because it's helpful, maybe you're an audible listener, I would very much encourage you to do that because it's free. So using those resources. Next slide. Okay, so the next 3 slides are just some quotes from people in Colorado of what worked for them. So one of the suggestions is to find a study buddy. Whenever I was preparing for the exam, I did a lot of the studying on my own, but I also paired up with someone from a neighboring jurisdiction so that we could go over questions and kind of figure out, why did I get this wrong? Or why did you get it right? We would just meet, have dinner, and sit there for like 3 hours. If you do that, please buy something from that restaurant. But we were able to use each other kind of as a sounding board to figure out, what should I be focusing on? And can you walk me through these questions? Very similar to what we did today. Next slide. Studying and passing the exam is a major milestone. So, I mentioned this, that while you're studying, you may be learning things that, oh, that's why we do that in my professional practice, or this is something that I'm going to try doing. So I don't know if y'all have experienced that, but it's definitely something that I did, and a few people in our office who are studying for the exam now have been witnessing that as a fun side effect of all of this studying. Next slide. Okay, just to be frank with y'all, memorizing everything super sucks because we only have so much brain capacity. But as mentioned, this is something that you're doing for a specific goal. Jam packing as much information as possible. Please take breaks though. You know, memorizing and studying and doing all of that, if you're not letting yourself rest, it's not going to stick. So just taking that time to step back, take a break. The night before I took my exam, I thought I was going to study, and I ended up watching Law and Order for however many hours. And then the next morning, whenever you get to the facility, they'll make you put all of your stuff away in a locker. And I tried to, you know, do some last minute studying, but you truly don't know what questions are going to be on there. And knowing that y'all are starting now and you've already been studying, the information that you need, it's already up there, meaning in your brain. So, you know, force feeding it at some time, it's okay to just put pencils down, as you know, just the saying goes. Okay, next slide. Okay, we are done. This is our contact information. If y'all are getting through, you know, different points in your studies where you're like, I need help me, please reach out to any of us. We can get you in touch with others that are part of APA Colorado. So Erin mentioned that we do have some board members that have different expertises than ours, you know, transportation, environmental. For those who have been concerned, you know, heard this a couple of times this morning about, well, you know, I'm a landscape architect or I'm a PE. That's okay. It's very, very okay. Those are adjacent professions. There is a lot of crossover. If you have done your PE or your Larry, you've done something super, super hard. So you're already more prepared than you think. This is a huge milestone. Taking the step to take the exam is also major. So please feel proud of yourselves today, being very serious about this, because it can be really tough. Whenever you feel overwhelmed, step away, take a break. It'll be there when you come back. So I see that there's a lot of chat. I think y'all have been answering questions. But with that said, are there any questions from y'all? How does everybody feel? Hopefully okay.
So just to let you guys know, we will send out via email to everyone that registered. I think everyone that's here registered. I'll send out the PowerPoint. I'll also send out a PDF that's a resource list. So it sort of has what Morgan mentioned, plus several of the states. Some of the states have their PDOs or paid positions. So they have a much more robust training than our volunteer positions. Not to disparage us, we're doing a great job, but we'll send out links to those states. I see the podcast was mentioned. We have links to that, some of the resources that are online. So we'll send all of that out. I'll do it here in just a second. It looks like there's at least one person that's interested in doing a study group. Oh yeah, and Quizlet. Good thought, Morgan.
Based on that, it was something that we went on some trip and I just sat in the back seat and just flipped through, you know, just kind of robotically all of the flashcards, but it's an app. Quizlet's not the only one. There are other resources out there. If you do choose to download it, be mindful of the fact that it's crowdsourced. So just verify that the information is correct. But there are also other professional exams that may be included in those apps. So just search for AICP and look at those flashcards.
And our contact information will be in the email that I sent out. It'll be in the presentation. We'll put this recording up online if you want to revisit it. The past videos, we kind of go through the same thing, but there's different conversations. So you can take a look at that. I would highly recommend, I know someone said they're participating in the Florida prep, and those are all recorded as well. So let us know what questions you have, what successes you have. We look forward to seeing your name on the list of folks that pass their AICP, and would love to recognize you at a state conference coming up. So we'll make sure to keep on that. But yeah, if you have questions that come up, even if it's something that you think is minor and you just want to walk through it, we're happy to do that. So Peyton, it's sort of a little bit more of a complex formula in terms of the percentage of questions you need to get right to pass. There's not a specific number, and you won't know what question, you won't necessarily know what you get right and wrong. If you look at the things that I will say, is Colorado, and I'm sorry, Joanne and Yasi, I don't have this information for Colorado, but or for California, but Colorado typically has higher pass rates than the national average. So you guys are in good company. Looks like final score around 75%. And again, it's weighted, so it's hard to know. Some questions will be more than others. That's why we kind of say try to get those gimmies, right? You just get those ones, and those will count towards your score. The other thing that I would say is there are quite a few people that don't pass the first time. Not a ton, but it may happen to you. And we've had folks that have joined us for multiple prep exams. I have a planner that I work with regularly. Actually several planners that I can think of off the top of my head that it took them 2 or 3 times to pass, and they did pass. And that's frustrating, and no one wants that, but it doesn't have any reflection on your adequacy as a planner, right? Some of this is test taking, and so that's why we spend some time talking about test taking skills, right? Marking questions, going back to questions, reading questions carefully. We're all adults, and we've all taken many standardized tests in our lives, so you probably know what works for you and what doesn't work. So if there's something that we suggested today that you're like, that would never be a successful strategy, then don't do that. Just pass that by. So with that, we'll stop. Please consider hitting up some of the folks that are on here. I'm with Morgan. I had a study group we had 3. We met every Saturday for many, many weeks. And it was helpful. Part of it is just helpful to commiserate, right? And talk about how you're studying, what's been helpful. Hey, I came across this great article. I came across this great resource. So I would highly encourage that. And there are some folks in the metro area that are doing in-person study groups. I know most of you aren't in the Denver metro area, but maybe you want to form a mountain study group and meet and study on the ski slope once a month or something. Who knows?
And I will say the person that I studied with, whenever she and I were doing that, she was prepping for the 3rd time for her to take the exam. And it was not at all, she was not a bad planner. It's not that she was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. It was, like Erin said, very much focused on how to be comfortable taking the exam itself. After we studied and took the exam at the same time, she did pass. So as Erin said, please do not, if there is a chance that you don't pass, do not let that discourage you, make you think all of those, those creeping thoughts that come in and, I'm a bad planner. No, it's standardized testing is hard. I usually say this to start off. I have test anxiety. I definitely studied too much. I needed to rein it in, but it was something that was a lot for me. If you are that person, I see you. Reach out to me if you need any help. But it's not a reflection on you as a professional.
Any last words? We'll end and go enjoy our hopefully less snowy Saturdays for those of us in Colorado. All right, well, best of luck to you all. I look forward to working with you as you become AICP. Please reach out if you have questions. If you need additional resources, we're happy to help. And best of luck. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.